Believe it or not, Charles Lindbergh was not the first aviator to cross the Atlantic Ocean. And the first plane wasn't the Spirit of St. Louis. It was a Navy seaplane named NC-4, piloted by a Coast Guard aviator named Elmer Stone. The full story is next on Mark in History. This is the historical marker to honor the men of the U.S. Coast Guard who established Coast Guard aviation back in 1925. This marker is located in Essex County, Massachusetts. The flying boat you see here on the marker is very similar to the first airplane to cross the Atlantic Ocean. U.S. Coast Guard aviation has a long history, beginning in 1903. Personnel from Kill Devil Hills Life Saving Station helped carry materials to the launch site for the first successful heavy-in-the-air aircraft flight by the Wright brothers at Kitty Hawk, North Carolina. It was surfer man John T. Daniels who took the famous picture of man's first powered flight on December 17, 1903. Only 16 years later, the Coast Guard's first pilot, named Lieutenant Elmer Stone, completes the original transatlantic crossing on board the U.S. Navy's NC-4 seaplane. It was May 27, 1919. 8 years before Charles Lindbergh made his historic solo flight across the Atlantic. When the United States entered the Great War in April 1917, the U.S. Navy needed flying boats to patrol against German U-boats in the Atlantic. The Glenn Curtiss Airplane and Motor Company had supplied the British and the Russians with flying boats throughout the war and was among the premier designers and manufacturers of this type. So it wasn't surprising that in 1917, the Navy and Curtiss decided to work together to produce a new large aircraft to be known as the Navy Curtiss or NC Flying Boat. The new planes, affectionately known as Nancy's, had a wingspan of 126 feet and an overall length of 69 feet. These seaplanes landed and took off from the water. They had 4 Liberty engines that produced 1,200 horsepower. One engine was centrally installed above the fuselage, and 2 others were supported on each side between the upper and lower wings. A pusher engine was located in the back of the plane. In 1919, officers in charge of the U.S. Navy decided to demonstrate the capability of their seaplanes with a first transatlantic flight. Because the planners knew that seaplanes had to stop several times along the way for repairs and refueling, theirs was not to be a continuous journey. For comparison, Lindbergh made his solo transatlantic trip in less than a day and a half. NC-4 would take almost 3 weeks to cross the Atlantic. At every stop, from New York to Lisbon, Portugal, they had to wait for parts to be delivered or bad weather to clear before they could take off again. Originally, 4 seaplanes designated NC-1, NC-2, NC-3, and NC-4 would fly together as a group across the Atlantic. However, due to storm damage and fire, NC-2 was cannibalized to fix both wings of NC-1 before the journey even began. Unlike Charles Lindbergh, NC-4 pilot Elmer Stone had some help. This huge Navy seaplane had a crew of 6. The commander-navigator and 2 pilots rode in open cockpits. A radio operator and 2 flight engineers resided in the back, but were able to squeeze forward between fuel tanks to visit the other crew. The commanding officer and navigator for NC-4 was U.S. Navy Lieutenant Commander Albert Reed. He sat here in the nose of the plane with only goggles and a flight suit to protect him from the elements in an open cockpit. two pilots sat here in tandem. It was piloted by 3rd Lieutenant Elmer Stone. He had the honor of being the very first trained aviator in the U.S. Coast Guard. The Navy requested him on this first transatlantic flight because of Stone's vast experience and abilities flight testing seaplanes and his navigational skills. Navy Lieutenant Junior Grade Walter Hinton was his co-pilot on this mission. E. H. Howard had been chosen to go as one of the flight engineers, but 2 weeks before the journey began, Howard lost a hand in misjudging his distance from a whirling propeller. Consequently, he was replaced by Ensign Eugene Rhodes. On Friday evening, May 16, 1919, 18 aviators and 3 Navy seaplanes sped through the waters of Trepassey Harbor, Newfoundland, and lifted off into the gathering darkness over the Atlantic. The evening takeoff was necessary so that they could reach the Azores before sunrise the next day and enjoy daylight landing conditions. They would not fly alone in the dark. 21 U.S. Navy destroyers were stationed at 50-mile intervals across the Atlantic Ocean. The destroyers served as visual and radio navigation aids and communication links. They were also there to provide weather intelligence and, if necessary, rescue service. These station ships blazed their searchlights and fired bright star shells into the night sky to help the aviators stay on their intended flight path. Now, you might get the impression that the flight was a very simple affair, having the security of all those Navy destroyers strung out between Newfoundland and the Azores. But remember, this was 1919, when aerial navigation across a great trackless sea was difficult, when aircraft radio was primitive and definitely unreliable, and when many flight instruments had yet to be invented. It was not going to be easy to zero in on 9 tiny islands scattered across several hundred miles of ocean. If an eastbound pilot missed the Azores during the 1,380-mile flight, his next landfall was Africa, hundreds of miles away. The night passed without incident. The huge flying boats flew over destroyers with reassuring regularity during their midnight flight to the Azore Islands. During the night, the planes broke formation to avoid the risk of collision. Troubles began at dawn with the onset of dense fog. Because of the weather, NC-3 misidentified a different ship on the foggy horizon as one of the station destroyers, which took the plane off course. After running low on fuel, Commander Towers decided to land his plane and crew to get a navigational fix. The seas were running high, and the landing was so rough that the impact collapsed the struts supporting the engines. At this point, NC-3 could only float. NC-1 had similar navigation problems with the fog, but landed on the rough seas without incident. Once down, however, the plane could not take off again because they were battling 12-foot high waves that were breaking over the hull. Luckily, the 12 crew members from NC-1 and NC-3 survived. NC-3 had to be sailed and taxied backwards some 250 miles to the Azores, a formidable adventure on its own. NC-1 was lost at sea, but their crew was rescued by a Greek freighter. NC-4 had also lost sight of those Navy ships and was virtually disoriented in the fog. At one point, the fog was so thick that the crew could not see from one end of the plane to the other. Soon, Coast Guard pilot Elmer Stone became totally disoriented, causing him to almost put the cumbersome plane into a dreaded spiral dive. Only Stone's vast experience and training got the plane righted in time. After more than 15 hours in the air, Commander Reed's dead reckoning navigation and Ensign Rod's radio reports gave assurance that NC-4 was very near the Azores. A sharp lookout was kept by all hands. Suddenly, island greenery appeared through a small break in the fog. It was Flores, one of the western islands in the Azores chain. Using Flores as a checkpoint, NC-4 landed at Horta Harbor a bit before noon on May 17, 1919. Within minutes, a great bank of fog blotted out the port completely. After almost 3 days of rain, fog, and high seas, NC-4 took off for their next stop, Ponta Delgada, 172 miles away, which they reached in less than 2 hours. The crew was ready to take off for Lisbon, Portugal the next day, but weather and engine troubles delayed departure for a week. Finally, on Tuesday morning, May 27, 1919, NC-4 took off on the final leg of its transatlantic trip, from Ponta Delgada, the Azores, to Lisbon, Portugal, a distance of 920 miles. Another chain of destroyers extended between the Azores and Lisbon. As NC-4 flew over them, each ship radioed her passage to the base ship in Lisbon, who in turn reported to the Navy Department in Washington, D.C. On the final leg of their journey, it was getting dark. All eyes in NC-4 peered eastward where the horizon was fading into the deep purple of twilight. Then, at 7:30, at the center of that darkening line, there flashed a diamond spark of light. It was the Cabo da Roca lighthouse. The westernmost point in Europe had been sighted. The big aircraft passed over the Portugal coastline and turned southward towards Lisbon. 20 minutes later, on May 27, 1919, the NC-4's keel sliced into the waters of the Tagus River. Lisbon gave the crew a great ovation, which lasted almost 2 days. A transatlantic flight, the first one in the history of the world, was an accomplished fact. After May 1919, the world knew that aviators would fly the Atlantic again. But only one plane was the first to make that transatlantic flight. That honor belongs to the U.S. Navy, to Lieutenant Commander Albert Reed, Third Lieutenant Elmer Stone, and the rest of the NC-4 crew. Today, this historical flying boat resides in the Naval Aviation Museum in Pensacola, Florida. Charles Lindbergh, speaking of his 1927 solo transatlantic flight to Paris, said, "I had a better chance of reaching Europe in the Spirit of St. Louis than the NC boats had of reaching the Azores. I had a more reliable type of engine, improved instruments, and a continent instead of an island for a target. It was skill, determination, and a hard-working crew that carried the NC-4 to the completion of the first transatlantic flight." If history can be taught with stories, it can never be forgotten. Please like our video, subscribe to our channel, and ring the bell to stay informed on the latest videos. And don't forget to leave your comments and suggestions below for what markers you want to see next.